Hello there, everyone. I'm Zach Richards, and today I'm going to be talking to you about constitutional rights within disaster policy. So, this is a pretty important topic. There's a lot of disasters in today's political climate. It's important to know what your rights are. So, let's just dive right into it. In this video today, I'm going to be talking about the constitutional basis of the U.S., the U.S. Constitution in terms of disaster policies, explain what your different rights are, and the citizens' rights juxtaposed to the powers granted to various levels of the government. Also going to be talking to constitutional applications in disaster policy. So how does the Constitution actually apply in a disaster situation? We're talking about federalism, the bottom-up implementation pattern of disaster response. Also, I'm going to briefly look at a couple times when rights were violated of victims of disasters and emergency scenarios. So let's just go right in here. Constitutional basis overview. So the Constitution and the Bill of Rights do form the basis of most disaster policies. Now, the document sets the guidelines of how citizens and the government interact on a legal basis, and the rights and powers given to each party. Understanding the concepts of federalism and the interaction between citizens and government, that highlights the reasons why the bottom-up implementation pattern is so successful. It's pretty natural when you look at how the government is structured. Now, everyone involved in policymaking and emergency management should be familiar with the basic rights and principles and understand what can and cannot be done constitutionally. And this really helps things run a lot smoother, helps improve public opinion of the situation. And of course, activities or commands that cause rights to be suspended often have negative consequences. They're seen poorly by the public. Pretty self-explanatory why. So that's why it's important that, if something happens and you do have to temporarily restrict or suspend rights, it's important to tailor that and to make that as small as possible to keep the public on your side. So let's take a look at the individual rights we're talking about here real quick. Now, most people know about the First, the Second, and the Fifth Amendment. These are pretty basic amendments, very important, very useful, and they're talked about every day. The freedom of speech, the assembly, the press, religion, the right to bear arms, and keep quiet and plead the Fifth. As you can see the thing there, you don't have to self-incriminate yourself in court. Everybody pretty much knows these. Another part of the Fifth Amendment, though, that's not as often talked about, is compensation for public use of private property. So we're talking about eminent domain, as in if the government wants to use private property for public use. You have to be justly compensated for that before that can happen. That's pretty important. We're going to be looking at that here in just a little bit. Also, the 10th and the 14th Amendment, not quite as well known, but very, very important, especially for the government. This tells the government, this sets up the boundaries of, like, the 10th Amendment, for example. States' rights is a pretty hot button issue, and there's always seems to be some debate over whether it's a national issue, a state's issue, or both. And basically, the 10th Amendment says that any right not explicitly given to the federal government belongs to the states and the people within them. So that sets a pretty clear definition of what is required for disaster relief and response as well. Also, the 14th Amendment, called the Equal Rights Amendment, the Equality Amendment, whatever you want to say. All citizens are equal under the law, and that is, of course, extremely important also in disaster policy and any government response that does happen. Alright, so let's jump into part number 2, the constitutional applications to disaster policy. Let's first go into federalism, a pretty general topic. This is, of course, what the United States Constitution, the foundation of it, is based on. Let's talk about the main points here. Federalism is a compromise of confederations, so a very weak conglomeration of states that agree upon things. So this was the Articles of Confederation. This was the first try at the U.S. right after we declared our independence. We won the Revolutionary War. And then like a national unitary government. So like what Britain was, where there's like one arm of the government that controls everything pretty much, either whether this is like a unitary, like a monarchy, a dictatorship, or something where there's only like one branch of the government, one legislature, whatever. It's a compromise between those two. Basically, some rights and powers are given to the federal government, some are given to the states. If we take a look over here at the Venn diagram, you got national powers, maintaining the military, declaring war, the postal service, patents, protection, weights and measures, You got some state powers that are setting up schools, establishing and regulating corporations, marriage regulations. And then there's some things that both do, as everybody's probably aware of. There's taxes at every level of the government. There's courts at every level of the government. Interstate commerce, borrowing money. But what I really want you to pay attention to is providing for the general welfare. Like I said earlier, and this is really important for the next slide I'm about to show you, but it's important for every level of the government to provide for the general welfare of the people that they have control over, the government of whatever your area is, and we call this the bottom-up implementation pattern in emergency management. Just as in federalism, there's a shared responsibility between different levels of government in a disaster response. So local officials are directly responsible for the welfare of their residents. If something happens that's overwhelming to them, they ask neighboring communities, whatever, they ask the state for assistance. So I put Florida up here. As you can see, repping FSU, I put us up as an example. Florida's had a lot of hurricanes recently. As soon as you see some prominent cities here in Florida, as soon as these local cities are overwhelmed, they ask the state for assistance. Often they do this these days before the storm comes. They're like, no, we need help. They know they need it. So Florida declares state of emergency. They get their resources together. Florida already knows, this is going to be crazy, we need assistance. So after they determine what they need, they say we need more than what we can provide, then they ask FEMA. Only then can they get the federal assistance, after the local and the state levels have been overwhelmed, and then it works its way back down the chain. So this kind of goes to say that, it starts at the basic level, it starts at the bottom, we need help, it works its way up. The federal government at no point should be overreaching and coming down and taking over the entire situation, at least without the consent of everybody else underneath saying, we need help and we need it now. Alright, so let's take a look real quick here, a couple of situations when rights are violated. And of course, this is going to start out with something that really hit home for a lot of people here in the South, Hurricane Katrina. We all remember, we either know someone who is affected, or we've watched it on the news, all the heart-wrenching images of just the destruction and devastation. But even some of our most basic rights have been violated by the government at different levels somewhere during this event. The First Amendment, you probably remember, if you were paying attention to the news at this time, there was a big upheaval about the press being barred from accessing the disaster sites. The military didn't want them to see the floating bodies in the street and all of just the awful things that were there, whether that was an accountability thing, like, oh, we don't want to look bad, or something else. The government's always doing something, seems to be always doing something shady to fuel the conspiracy theories or whatever. There always just seems to be something going on, but that happened. Also, in some of the worst, hardest hit areas, firearms were forcibly confiscated, which of course, creates a massive upheaval and is definitely unconstitutional. Actually, this is probably the most interesting one of all of them, the Fifth Amendment. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was actually found liable for exacerbating the flooding due to the levee breaches and not dredging properly. There was a whole bunch of things to it, but there's actually a court case. This just came out a couple years ago. I've included it at the end, the link to it, if you are interested in that. But yeah, they said that they deprived the citizens of their property with the flooding. So yeah, it's an interesting take on it, but another right that has been violated. Also, the Sixth Amendment, things you don't really think about. Trials in the disaster age were delayed for weeks and months. Things that happened, months or years before the storm ever existed, before anybody knew that New Orleans was going to be wiped off the face of the earth and flooded out. So just these little things you have to keep in mind during disasters. Another thing real quick, let's talk about World War II. A very dark chapter in the history of the world, but here in America, we didn't get off quite scot-free. Japanese internment was a very dark part in our history as well. And I mean, the rights violations here should be pretty obvious. Just inside the camps, things were not that great. It wasn't Germany, but it definitely wasn't great. They have the Japanese language was banned in gatherings. They censored the media. Obviously, the forcible removal of them from their homes and putting them in the camp they obviously didn't want to go to. Definitely not constitutional. Search and seizure of property without warrant. Definitely not constitutional. Poor, cruel and unusual punishment. Poor health care. Poor nutrition. They didn't let them vote. Yeah. Like I said, this is pretty obvious. This is definitely something that we've hopefully learned our lesson from and never happens again. Alright guys, I want to thank you for watching this video. Hopefully everybody learned something today about emergency management and the constitutional rights within disaster policies. I've included the sources here. Like I said, I hope you enjoyed the video, and everybody have a great day.